From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Salinger-Morris. It's Tuesday, October 14th. Last week, 10 million Optus customers woke to no phone or internet coverage. And then the problems dominoed from there. Melbourne's entire train network came to a screeching halt, and phone lines to hospitals were down. Some people were unable to call 000 if they needed to. For several hours, Optus' CEO was also missing in action. And a 2-line statement on the company's website, that customers without internet couldn't see, said that Optus was aware of an issue and was working to restore services as quickly as possible. Today, technology editor David Swan on getting to the bottom of what caused the 16-hour Optus outage ahead of the CEO's expected appearance before a Senate inquiry this week. So David, was the way that Optus responded to the outage essentially a lesson in how not to handle a crisis?
The simple answer to that is yes, absolutely. These things normally get sorted in an hour or two, for example, but this is an outage that went all day. It started at, and I wasn't awake by this point, but it started at 4 a.m. on the dot. Optus had a statement on its website by about 6:30 a.m. About 6:47 is when you can pinpoint it. And that was about 2.5 hours later after the outage first started. And I was almost awake by this point. It was my wife, actually. She's like, oh, there's been an Optus outage. And normally these things last an hour or two, right? So I was like, oh, okay, big deal. Probably by the time I even start work really properly, it'll be fixed. Not the case. This dragged on all day.
10 million Optus customers are still without mobile and broadband services amid a massive nationwide outage.
This is the biggest telco outage in Australian history.
What has Optus had to say? Well, a little more than, quote, we know there's an issue that may be affecting some customers.
Well, Optus certainly isn't saying much, and what they have said seems to undercook the problem massively. It's not some customers that may be affected, it's millions of customers nationwide who are being impacted right now.
It wasn't until about 10:30 a.m. that we finally heard from Optus' chief executive, Kelly Bayer-Rosmarin, who had to use WhatsApp to dial into ABC radio because the Optus network was down.
It would be great if the media could continue to direct people to our website, to the My Optus app, where it's very clear what customers need to do.
Well, we have been reading the short statement that you have put out, but if they don't have internet, they can't go to the website.
She then gave a few more radio interviews throughout the morning and the afternoon.
The CEO, Kelly Bayer-Rosmarin, is on the line. She's made herself finally available for us. You were missing in action for hours.
Actually, we've had messages out from the beginning. We have messages on our website.
Yeah, but people have got no internet, so they can't access the information.
She was apologetic, but couldn't give really any answers as to what had happened.
So we're very sorry that this occurred, and we'll now do a thorough root cause analysis and make sure that we capture all the learnings from what occurred.
Federal Communications Minister Michelle Rowland was giving press conferences herself and sort of being a de facto Optus executive, really, saying that, you know, this is a core network issue, we think, and was pretty visibly furious. I think she'd felt like there'd been a lack of communication from Optus to customers, and the communications minister was stepping up in that place, saying, on behalf of customers, it felt like, or on behalf of Australians more broadly, saying this is unacceptable.
This has been a frustrating morning. It is vital for Optus to be transparent and timely in the updates that it is giving to its customers about the nature of the fault, its impacts and its possible rectification. It is essential.
So to become clear by that point, by the sort of lunchtime, afternoon, where I was like, okay, this isn't a typical outage. The train lines are down, hospitals are having issues, and we're left unable to make or receive calls. It was becoming clear to me in the newsroom and to people more broadly. It's like, this is on a scale that we haven't really seen before in terms of an outage. Beyond the CEO's response, there was the issue with how the company communicated critical information about 000. They first said it, I think it was at 10:17 a.m. that only landlines were impacted with 000, but not mobiles. And then almost 3 hours later, they tweeted that actually some mobiles were having issues connecting to 000. And they advised customers to, quote, find a family member or a neighbour with an alternate device, which is pretty shocking, really. So it just speaks to as well this muddled communication that was coming out through Optus, and that was the case all day.
And so the big question is one that couldn't be answered actually on the day, which is, do we finally know why this outage happened?
No, and that's what's crazy. Like, I'm not used to that. I've been reporting on technology for about 10 years, and that's included a multitude of outages. It's a pretty typical story for me. Every few months, Telstra will have an outage, say, Vodafone will have an outage. It's pretty standard stuff. But you know on the same day, oh, it was because of this. A rat chewed through a cord, or you know someone misconfigured something. You know what happened. And it's crazy that almost a week on that we still don't have an answer. I asked Kelly, the CEO of Optus, Kelly Bayer Rosemarin, on Friday. I said, what's happened? And she said, I don't have a simple, what was the exact phrase? It was like, I don't have a one-line answer to give you. Well, I'm like, well, that's fine. Give me a 5-line answer. Give me a 5-paragraph answer. Give me the answer. Don't just, it's been the theme throughout this outage of trying to probe to get real answers. And instead it's left us having to talk to sources who are there or around there, or to pontificate of, okay, this is likely what's happened. So we know it probably wasn't a cyber attack, for example. We know it was probably due to a third-party equipment issue rather than one of Optus's own pieces of technology. So what we do know is basically it's probably one or two pieces of equipment that failed, probably due to a faulty update, because the outage started exactly 4 o'clock, not 4:05, 4:10, it was 4:00, and that means it was probably an update. Routers and other networking infrastructure, they do require regular updates, just like your Windows or Mac computer or your iPhone would. And these are always planned during hours when we're asleep, basically, to have minimal impact. So that's why the fact that it was at 4 a.m. on the dot does point to, okay, there was a planned upgrade here of the system that failed, that then, as Optus have put it, this is the one piece of information they actually have said, is there was a fault that then cascaded throughout the rest of the Optus network. So sort of an issue with one or two pieces of hardware that then affected things nationally.
We'll be right back. So, David, is there a bigger issue at play here? Perhaps chronic underinvestment when it comes to our cables and things like that?
I think that's right, and I think these are issues that will come to light through the various numbers of inquiries that have already been announced. I think we do take for granted how connected everything is. It's times like this we realise, okay, things are more vulnerable than we realised. So I'd expect follow-on stories to come out sort of this week of people who, you know, either were greatly injured or died because they weren't able to get the health access that they needed, which is horrible, obviously. It all points to maybe we've taken some of our telecommunications infrastructure for granted somewhat. Maybe we haven't invested as much as we needed to make sure that the redundancies and backups are in place.
But our country has actually suffered through major network outages before. I know providers Vodafone and Telstra have had outages. So can you explain why this outage had so many more profound consequences?
Yeah, there have been any number of communications outages over the past decade since I've been reporting on technology. Vodafone had a particularly bad time in 2010, for example, over about a 2-year period. They earned themselves the Vodafail moniker, and about 2 million customers left the telco over that period. This has been the worst outage that I've reported on, and I think it speaks to just how interconnected everything is in a way that it wasn't in previous years. The fact that now we have fibre networks that then, you know, serve as the backbone for mobile towers, for example, and all the other infrastructure. Everything's just connected to each other in a way that previously things were more siloed, and you could have one thing fail, but it's okay because, you know, there are other parts of the network that are fine, and everything's much more interconnected now. That's what this has highlighted and made it clear that an outage of this magnitude just affects everything: ADMs, banks, health, absolutely everything.
Now, David, it's fair to say that the Optus CEO had a very bad day on the day of the outage, but it also wasn't her first. The telecommunications database was actually hacked last year, and the personal information of millions of its customers was exposed. So is Kelly Bayer Rosemarin going to keep her job?
That's $1 million question. at this point if she's going to last in the top role. I would say a couple of things. One is it stood out to me how little Optus and its leadership has learned over the past year. I reported on that hack that was about 13 months ago, and they were struggling to respond to it, struggling to communicate, it seemed like they didn't have a plan in place of how to grapple with it. Medibank got hacked about a month later. It was night and day in terms of how they communicated about it. Medibank provided updates every morning about 7 a.m. I'd wake up and there was an email from Medibank Comms, statement from the CEO, here's the latest. Optus couldn't be more different in terms of how ad hoc it was in going about its communication, both with journalists and customers. They haven't learned 13 months later. So it'll be a very interesting week to see. She's going to get grilled for a Senate inquiry, for example. Journalists are going to continue to pursue this. It's a very open question as to whether she survives.
And Optus CEO Kelly Bayer Rosmarin is actually to front two separate inquiries. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So likely this Friday we have starting a Senate inquiry, which will be public, right? So like anyone will be able to tune in. And then separately to that, the Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland, has announced a separate inquiry into what's happened, but that's not public facing. The public mood is very much against Optus right now, and people are pretty angry. People are upset, and especially the 200 gigabytes that customers are being offered as, we're very sorry. Most people don't care about 200 gigabytes of free data. To most people, data is a freely available commodity. Most people don't use even half of their allocated data on their mobile plans. What would have maybe made a real difference is, we're cutting your plan's price in half by 50% next month, like actual monetary compensation.
And this presumably will not be the last outage we experience. So what's being done to prevent it from happening again?
Yeah, outages are a fact of life. There was a huge outage in Canada last year that was at a similar level to what we've seen with Optus. But what Canada did as a result is they passed a few laws making sure that telcos share infrastructure in the case of an outage. So in this case, it would have been Telstra, you have to share your network with Optus. Also that it forced telcos in Canada to have communications plans about how they communicate with customers, which would have been pretty handy here, I think, if that had been the case. So there's no silver bullet, obviously, for an outage. But in the case of an emergency, for example, this is a law that they are actively looking at in Australia. Can you force telcos to share their networks with each other to make sure that people can get onto 000 in a bushfire, for example? And something like that seems pretty common sense. And I think the telcos will likely be on board with it. It's pretty clearly unacceptable to everybody that 000 wouldn't work in some instances. It's like that's the bare minimum. It's people's lives. That should work as a minimum.
David, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Late on Monday afternoon, after we recorded this episode, Optus released a new statement about the cause of the outage. It said the network received changes to routing information from an international peering network following a routine software upgrade. Optus said the changes exceeded safety levels on key routers, resulting in those disconnecting from the core network. Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Tammy Mills. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or sm8.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.